They were all individuals who felt that time had been stolen from them, and that when they came back to Australia, they would try and make good of their life. And they would do things that perhaps more timid souls wouldn't. And I think they had a kind of inbuilt courage and determination just to pursue things because they'd seen life at its most basic.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In 1948, Australian psychiatrist and former POW John Cade, who came from the little Western Victorian town of Horsham, discovered that lithium could effectively treat manic depressive illness. In today's terms, we know it more as bipolar disorder. This discovery has been labelled as important for mental health as penicillin was for infection. Lithium has saved to date millions of lives, prevented suicides, and restored stability to those suffering from bipolar disorder. But despite its profound impact, John Cade, the man who discovered this use, is largely unknown. But joining me to discuss the story of John Cade is another psychiatrist, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Sydney's Westmead Hospital, Greg Damore. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Greg.
Thanks, Georgina. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's great to have you on. And Greg, you've written a book a few years ago now, Finding Sanity, John Cade, Lithium and the Taming of Bipolar Disorder, which I guess has combined two of your loves, your love of psychiatry and, of course, your love of history. You've written other history books as well.
Indeed, I have. It's interesting. When you hear the title of the book, sometimes people think books just appear. And when I think of how much effort went into it in terms of the 10 years of research, but the genesis of the book actually goes back to when I was a medical student at Melbourne University, Royal Melbourne Hospital. And I tell this story because I'm often asked how I picked up this thread. And it relates to being a medical student. I was not a very good medical student. I was actually very good at school. I did extremely well at school. I won a scholarship to go to Wesley College. Grew up in a very working class area of Melbourne, so going to Wesley College from where I lived and grew up North Melbourne was like going to Jupiter. It was on the other side of Melbourne, and people did things and their parents did sort of work that I'd never even heard of before. So where I came from, no one was a professional at all. I don't think I even knew anyone who'd even been to university before I went to Wesley. But when I got finished there and loved mathematics and sciences and got into medicine at Melbourne Uni. And I really didn't know what I was doing there. I was very young. I'd only just turned 17 and I was confronted with this huge university with massive lecture theatres. And as I said, I wasn't the most assiduous of students. And I know when psychiatry came along, now fifth year, the one thing I was certain of was that I didn't want to be a psychiatrist. And so I avoided pretty much all the lectures and tutorials for the first 6 or 7 weeks. Until about a week or two before the exam, I thought I should try and learn something. So in my usual way, I turned up for one of my first lectures, hoping the lecturer wouldn't notice that I'd been absent for the last near 2 months. And I remember he pointed me out deliberately because I was in the front row, and he said, where have you been? And I tried to explain somewhat lamely that I had been there, but he punished me that day. And he forced me to see one of my first ever psychiatry patients. And that was a patient at One North, which was a psychiatry unit at Royal Melbourne. And that really changed my professional life because I saw a young man who was my age who had early schizophrenia, which is it's a serious illness where people are psychotic and they often hear things, sometimes see things, but they imagine things. And his life was tormented by this poor young man. But I couldn't help thinking that he and I had drawn different lots in life. And I remember thinking as I left that 1 hour in One North at Royal Melbourne that this was the most interesting thing I had done in almost 5 years of medicine, and almost instantaneously decided to be a psychiatrist. And so the next day, when I came to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, I actually went to the library for one of the first times in 5 years. And I found a small sliver of a book written by Dr. John Cade. And in it, there was a chapter on lithium, which is a substance we use to treat another serious illness called bipolar disorder. It used to be called manic depressive disorder. And what I loved about it, and I can still remember this as a medical student all those years ago, is that although John Cade wrote this book and wrote that chapter, although he indeed, in fact, had been the discoverer of lithium for bipolar disorder, he actually didn't mention it in that chapter. And I always remember thinking it was a kind of humility that was so different to the world I was living in and very, very different to the world we live in now, where anyone who gets 30 seconds of fame is just plastered all over the internet and everyone knows it, even when you don't want to know it.
It's a wonderful story of how you came to your profession, but also getting that sort of insight into what sort of man John Cade was. He comes from Western Victoria, and of course, the Robert Menzies Institute, we're always interested in the Menzian connections. That his hometown of Horsham is about, an hour, 45 minutes away from Jeparat, where Robert Menzies himself was born a few years before in 1894. They would have been about 18 years difference in age, but their early upbringings must have been quite similar in the agricultural district of Western Victoria.
Yes.
But he's born, isn't he, into a medical family in that lead up to World War I, and of course all the sort of difficulties of World War I, which becomes, even though he's a baby, a young boy at the time, it becomes quite fundamental to the trajectory of his life, doesn't it?
It's very much fundamental. So he was born in 1912 and his father was a local general practitioner. And it's just fascinating to see what men did, even if they had families. So when World War I broke out, John Cade's father signed up with a field ambulance and went to fight in Gallipoli and the Western Front. And his life, so John Cade's father's life, was changed dramatically by his wartime experiences. And I found some letters and documents that talked about some of the horrific things he had to see and deal with as an army doctor. And so when he comes back to Australia after World War I, he had what they termed back then shell shock, which is a term which we might translate into something like post-traumatic stress disorder in the early 21st century. But essentially, it's where a man or woman, anyone, is so confronted by various experiences that it essentially shocks the brain, if you like, and people have flashbacks and nightmares and irritability and anxiety and depression. So when he comes back, he actually can't settle back into his Western Victorian bucolic practice. It's just too out of place from having been fighting. So what he decides to do is that he decides to take his wife and John, his son, to an asylum. So he decides to leave general practice and he decides to become what they call a mental hospital doctor. He didn't really need any qualifications then. So he took the whole family from Western Victoria to Beechworth in northeast Victoria, which is, of course, a beautiful town for people who don't know it. And there was a large psychiatric hospital of something like 2,000 patients.
It's still there to this day, isn't it, Greg?
It's still there, but it has been decommissioned.
Yes, I was there last year, I think it was, with my family touring around. And, we weren't there as patients. We were there as tourists. But it's quite a feature of the town. It really is a focal point of Beechworth, isn't it?
It's extraordinary. And I think in the John Cade story, why it's so important is that he dislocates from Western Victoria. His dad comes back as an army veteran. And for a period of time, Cade grows up as a young child on the grounds of a mental hospital. And why it's so important, and when we look at Cade's overall life and why it related to his later accomplishments, is that I feel in that early environment, he got to see patients with mental illness first as people and not so much as a constellation of symptoms and signs, which you can sometimes feel now when you see someone, you tick off the symptoms and come to a diagnosis. And he was well known to, as a child, befriended quite a number of patients. And I think it was an affection for the people who were afflicted with serious mental illness, an affection and a warmth towards them that he held for the entirety of his professional career.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective that he saw them with the innocence of childhood rather than with the kind of prejudices that an adult might have of people who are deeply unwell, mentally unwell. I mean, you write about how he's playing games with, people who think they're Jesus Christ and, obviously having real issues, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But he saw them as his friends rather than as people to be concerned about.
Yes, and it's interesting when I spoke to the family at large about what it was like growing up on asylum grounds. It was very much the typical thing of the times that psychiatrists, let's call them psychiatrists, they wouldn't have necessarily used that term back then. The psychiatrist and their family would live on the grounds because they'd be given a house, but they didn't feel any sense of fear. It was actually that the kids loved growing up in that environment, playing tennis with patients and so on, and there was no sort of trying to hide away their experiences, unlike the creation of an asylum, those big mental hospitals, often with large, high walls and very ornate gates. That was really a clear demarcation between what was within and what was without. And what was within were, of course, the patients and the staff, and what was without was the township itself. But Cade didn't note that. He wasn't really affected by that demarcation as such because he was inside. He was part of what was going on.
He was clearly a child at the time, but can you describe how his father and other psychiatrists or those sorts of doctors living in the mental health facilities, how they would have treated people with bipolar disorder?
Well, there were no treatments. So this is the thing that's astounding. And so when I say no treatments, let me just backtrack a little bit. Prior to the Second World War, there was no effective medication for any mental illness at all. Depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, schizophrenia, none whatsoever. The whole treatment was custodial. In other words, people would come into an institution like the one at Beechworth, and there were many around Melbourne. We can think of Kew Asylum was another classic one. Adelaide, Sydney, these large asylums where there might be thousands of patients. And what you would really do is you would often try and keep them safe and the people around them safe. You would try and hopefully give them reasonable nutrition, although nutrition was appalling at the time, and try and offer them some various things to do. But these patients might be decanted by their family and they may never be seen by their family again. Some of these patients would spend their entire lifetime within those walls. And so what was a doctor's role, given that there were no treatments? The doctor's role then was very much to look after the medical aspects, the physical aspects of care. These large asylums were actually run by usually nurses, very senior nurses, nursing unit managers. And for 2,000 patients, there was a time at Beechworth where there was only one or two doctors for up to 2,000 patients. So clearly you couldn't really care for patients in a meaningful way.
And what percentage of those patients, Greg, would have had some sort of disorder like bipolar or schizophrenia versus, say, the PTSD that we'd associate with returning from the war?
Yeah. So in a place like Beechworth before the war, the vast majority of patients would have what we call a psychosis. In other words, they would have lost touch with reality. They might see things that weren't there, hear voices, or imagine things. They might get very paranoid that someone's trying to harm them. And so most of the people would have had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which is a serious long-term illness that usually starts in adolescence, early 20s and goes through. Bipolar disorder, which is actually a mood disorder, but it's another lifelong illness, usually starts early in life. Or severe depression, that's a third type of diagnosis. There would have been patients back then with other diagnoses that we wouldn't necessarily place in a mental health unit today, such as different types of dementia, such as Alzheimer's dementia. And there are different sorts of dementia. There will also be a lot of patients who had problems related to, say, intellectual deficiency, what they would call back then mental retardation. We would now call it developmental delay. So you would have patients with various genetic abnormalities who would be in that mix as well as patients with straight neurological illnesses like epilepsy and Huntington's. So there was this kind of conglomerate of different sorts of patients, and they were all extremely unwell. I mean, to get a ticket into a place like Beechworth, you had to be unwell.
So Cade grows up in this environment, and not just at Beechworth. I think he moves to the Sunbury Asylum with his parents, doesn't he, and Mont Park Hospital. But
they come down to Melbourne as well, and he sees the various asylums in Melbourne.
But he gets into Melbourne Uni, follows in Robert Menzies' footsteps, not into law though, into medical school. And you, of course, Greg, end up following in his footsteps too a few decades later. But is he always very focused on psychiatry from a young age?
All.
No.
But what we do know is that he was a man with an immense curiosity. If you speak to anyone in the family and you read his notes, he was very observant of what was around him. He loved natural history and he would write notes of the detail of the animals he would see around him. So he was always noted for that kind of expanded curiosity. When he went from exactly at Scotch College, which was his secondary school, and he went into Melbourne University, his initial plan was to study pediatrics. And he finished studies. He also was very interested in chemistry. So that was very important, and it turned out to be important later on in his discoveries. So he finishes medical school at Melbourne Uni, and he initially wants to become a paediatrician. In those early years, as an internal resident, he'd spent some time at Royal Children's Hospital, which wasn't far. It's not far from Melbourne University. And before the war, while he was a resident there, a young doctor, he was struck down with bilateral pneumonia. Now, this was the era before penicillin, and that could have easily taken him away, clearly could have killed him. And I think the family thought that he was going to die. But he was nursed to health over a long period of time and recovered. And actually, one of the nurses who did nurse him back to health, her name was Jean, he must have taken a fancy to her because relatively soon after he recovered, he asked her out. And not too long after that, they actually got married.
Oh, and very sweet, if not a bit cliched, but lovely.
He must have had an epiphany whilst he was very unwell with pneumonia, because very soon after that, he ditched the notion of becoming a paediatrician and decided to follow in his father's footsteps and become a mental hospital doctor. And very soon after that, he returned to Beechworth as a young doctor. And again, there are only one or two other doctors there. He's a very young doctor in his 20s, a couple of thousand of patients, no treatments. And he did some really interesting things there. This is again before he went off to the Second World War. He noticed that a number of the patients had bruises. And he confided to his new wife that he feared the patients were being beaten by the attendants, the male nurses. That, in fact, wasn't happening. What, in fact, was happening was that the diet, the nutrition was so poor, so appalling, they were actually getting scurvy.
Oh.
And that was a momentous moment in the history of treating the mentally ill, because it was that observation, he wrote it up, and it was that observation that led to really some of the first dietitians being introduced into mental hospitals around the state of Victoria. And that was, largely precipitated by Cade's observation at Beechworth Hospital.
It's the 1930s. The drums of war are beating again, sadly. And 1939, Australia enters the war against Germany. And Cade enlists, doesn't he, in the army in 1940. And it's interesting. My grandfather would have been doing a very similar thing, having studied law, not medicine, but enlisting in the AIF. And in fact, they both find themselves in Singapore. And of course, with the fall of Singapore, the capture of Singapore by the Japanese, they end up in that horrible situation in the Changi prisoner of war camp.
Yes, it's extraordinary. You look at it, he signed up at the end of the 1930s, John Cade. So he's not quite 30, he's in his late 20s. But by this stage, he has two young boys in Melbourne, suburban Melbourne. His wife, two young boys. And when we read that now, you think, what would it take for a man in that situation who's got a professional career ahead of him, two young boys, to then follow in his own father's footsteps? John Cade joins the 2nd 9th Field Ambulance and travels to Malaysia as part of, or Malaya as it was called then, with the Australian Army, linked to the British Army, waiting for the Japanese, of course, to attack. It's very hard to imagine what must have been going through his mind, but clearly he had a strong sense of duty. And even though he was leaving two young boys behind, he felt that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's an incredible sense of duty and also personal sacrifice because, putting himself in quite serious danger as it was. Tell me about his time at Changi. What did it teach him and how did it help, I guess, him develop the insights that would lead to the discovery of lithium for bipolar disorder?
The time in Changi was extraordinary. So those who know anything about the island of Singapore, Changi is a section of the island of Singapore in the northeast corner. So, of course, when the Japanese defeated the Allies, they were faced with the invidious issue of what they would do with tens of thousands of Allied troops. And, of course, they created Changi Prison of War Camp. And for years, the Allies were almost in a community within a community. They would run a lot of things themselves. But for Cade, the important thing was this. When the Allies went into Changi Prison of War Camp, they converted some old, disused army barracks, or old British barracks there, and they turned them into makeshift hospitals. And there's one aspect of the story I love and we've got this confirmed by archives, when the British went in there, they decided in a somewhat bombastic way that there would be one hospital for the Changi prisoners, and it would be a British hospital. And they asked/commanded that the Australian doctors work for them. But I love the Australian response, and it's wonderful to actually read it. They told the British doctors where to go, and that we Australians, we will have our own hospital, thank you very much. So there are actually two hospitals in Changi, the British hospital and the Australian hospital. But the key thing was this: they shared a single ward, and that was a mental health unit. And no one knew about that until we went through the archives only a handful of years ago when we wrote this book. And unbelievably, in the middle of a Southeast Asian jungle, in the middle of World War II, there was a psychiatry unit of about 10 beds, and John Cade was the one who would tend the patients there. So his experiences during that time really shaped his thinking. And the main thing to get across is this. The causation of mental illness was always a vexed issue. Was it to do with something biological? Was it to do with your brain and chemistry? Or was it very much to do with the way you were brought up? If you were harshly treated or if you were neglected, would that shape maybe a future history of bipolar illness? And Cade's observations, we're reading a little bit between the lines, but he did record some of his thoughts. And one was, he remembers treating a young Australian soldier who had what we call a manic episode. A manic episode is where a patient is very elevated, they talk loudly, they talk quickly, and they lose touch with reality. They might think they've got special powers and gifts. And that's what you see in bipolar disorder when someone's high. And he thought this young soldier had manic depression or bipolar disorder. But this young man, this Australian soldier, dropped dead, and Cade performed an autopsy, and what he found was, to his surprise, a collection of blood under his skull that was pushing against the brain. He had what we call a subdural hematoma, which is a collection of blood. And why that's important is that collection of blood was pushing on the brain, and it then presented itself to an observer like he was mentally ill. In other words, he looked mentally ill, but it was actually a physical cause. It was a collection of blood that was just simulating bipolar disorder. Now, the bit we're reading between the lines is that we know these sort of experiences affected John Cade a lot. What we think happened is that by the end of the war, he was convinced that some psychiatric illnesses, probably like bipolar, were actually caused by something physically wrong with the body. Maybe a collection of blood, maybe a chemical problem, but a physical. And he wrote this famous letter after the war, and he thought he was going to be executed by the Japanese at the end of the war, but he wasn't. The Japanese slipped into the jungle. He and the others were rescued, and he was on a boat home, and he wrote this wonderful letter back to his wife in suburban Melbourne saying, Jean, I've had a lot of thoughts while I've been in Changi. He wants to do these experiments, and we think that it's all along the line of let's look for something chemical or physical in someone's body and brain who has an illness that's causing this illness. So he comes back home, and he comes back an emaciated veteran like they all did. And there's this very sort of beautiful story where one of his young boys couldn't recognize their father and refused to believe that was his father had run out of the lounge room screaming. But he comes back. And very soon he's back at work in an asylum in the northern edge of Melbourne, in a suburb called Bundoora. Because there's a little Bundoora mental hospital. It was very close to another hospital called Mont Park. And there was another hospital later on called Larundel. I'm sure you might be familiar with that in the northern suburbs. And all the patients at Bundoora Mental Hospital, they're all ex-soldiers from World War I, World War II. Patients with depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and so on. And we have this evidence from his wife that he was set upon trying to find a treatment for mood disorders, depression or bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder said is like being on a roller coaster, whether you're high in your mood or you're very low. And it's a lifelong illness, usually starts in your adolescence or 20s. And it's a very serious illness. And perhaps 1, 2, maybe even 3% of Australians have bipolar disorder. So there's a lot of people with it. But he asked himself this question. It's 1946. He's sitting in Bundoora. There's very little sophistication in terms of medical investigations. How will he find out what's causing mood disorder? So he has this idea. He just speculates that maybe if you've got bipolar disorder, you have a chemical in your body that courses through your bloodstream. And that when it's high, this chemical, it makes you manic. In other words, you're high and gregarious and loud and psychotic. And when it's very low in your blood, you're very depressed. So he has this idea that there's a putative.
Why does he think it's a chemical problem and not a physical problem like he'd observed in the patient in Changi with the subdural hematoma?
Well, we're not sure exactly. He didn't really write about that. What I could say is that if someone did have a subdural hematoma like that patient in Changi and it wasn't treated surgically, then there's a good chance that you would die.
Right, whereas he was observing these patients continuing
over
to
a
live.
long period of time. I think what we can take from it is that he took that leap thinking there's something physical. He may have thought in his early experiments and thoughts that there was something physical. It may not have been just a chemical thing, but he was very good at chemistry, as I mentioned, from school and university. So he also had this idea, there's an illness, there's the thyroid gland, which occurs right in the front of your throat. And you can either be hyperthyroid, where the thyroid gland is overactive and it releases a hormone that makes you hyperthyroid and you talk quickly. And if the thyroid gland is not functioning well, you can be hypothyroid and it can make you depressed. I mention this because we do have one of his textbooks and he did write in that textbook, and we think he might have used that physical illness of the thyroid disease as a template for bipolar. In other words, thyroid, when you were high, the hormone was high, and when the thyroid wasn't functioning well, the hormone was low. And he postulated, we think, the same thing was going somehow with bipolar disorder.
Greg, was it important to him to prove that these disorders were physical rather than by virtue of the environment in which these people had grown up, that it sort of was nothing they could have done about it occurring?
I think it was for him because to a degree it removes a little bit of the blame that could be apportioned to certain families. That's one aspect. But the other reason I think it's important, Georgina, for him is he was very much a doctor's doctor. He would actually carry a stethoscope with him. Not many psychiatrists in 2025 are carrying a stethoscope. He prided himself on his ability to take a physical history and examine someone. So that was important to him. So he has this notion that there's chemical coursing around patients with bipolar, that when they're high, it's high in the blood, and when it's low, they're depressed. But then he's got the problem, well, how can he find this chemical? So he then decides that maybe they pass this out in their urine. And it gets very fundamental at this point and not too sophisticated. So he asked the nursing staff to collect bottles of urine from all the bipolar patients. And I love this part because he thinks that maybe this chemical has been passed out in the urine, he's going to isolate it. But I love this next story because, of course, they're living on the grounds of this hospital, Bundoora Mental Hospital. His wife's there. They've got their kitchen and lounge room. And what I love is he'd bring these bottles back from the psychiatry wards and he'd place them in the family fridge. Because I often think his wife was the true heroine of this story.
At least she'd been a nurse, though. So
she was a nurse, but still, I think it's a lot. And we did ask his children when we were writing the book, because they were primary school age, the older boys in the late 40s, what they thought when they came home from primary school and they were pushing around the butter and other ingredients and had to push aside bottles of urine to find what they wanted. And they said to us, they just thought everyone's father collected urine and stuck it in the fridge, which I thought was an amazing story.
Well, so again, like his own childhood, they were sort of desensitized to its weirdness.
Desensitized and his curiosity. And, of course, he's doing this all by himself. He doesn't tell everyone because he's very worried that he might cause a problem anyway. So he collects the urine, and then what he does is he gets syringes and sucks the urine into syringes, and he injects them into guinea pigs, real guinea pigs, not people, real guinea pigs. And they all die because urine is toxic. Now, there's a substance in urine called uric acid. And for reasons we don't fully understand, he thought, and I'm simplifying it, he thought that uric acid might have a role in the causation of mood disorder. And to do a set of experiments, he needed to alter the uric acid and turn it into what we call a salt, a bit like sodium chloride, what we sprinkle on our fish and chips. He wanted to turn the uric acid into a thing called a salt. And the most soluble salt he could come up with was a thing called lithium urate. And this is where lithium comes in the story, almost by accident.
Yeah, it's amazing how often this is with these scientific discoveries, isn't it? Just sort of fiddling around in your kitchen with patients' urine, dead guinea pigs at the side.
That's right. He's got the gauge of guinea pigs. He's doing it in the kitchen. He adds the lithium to create lithium urate in the urine, and he sucks it up and he injects it into the guinea pigs. They all still die. But he does one thing, and this changes the course of medical history. Along the way, he wonders what would happen if he just gave a solution of lithium to the guinea pigs, if he just injected lithium into the guinea pigs. And so what he does, for reasons we don't fully understand, it might be what we call a control in science, where you just wonder what a substance will do on its own. He stirred up a solution of lithium in some salt water, and he sucked it into the syringe and he injected it into guinea pigs, and they stopped dying and they became very quiescent, very quiet. You could pick them up in the palm of his hand. And he was very excited by this. And his wife could recall to us that she could remember the day that he ran into the kitchen back in their house, dragged her from the sink and said, "Jean, look at this. This is amazing. I've injected lithium into these guinea pigs. They're not dead. They're just lying flat in my hand."
Greg, what had lithium prior to that been used for?
Okay. So lithium, when I mention lithium now, everyone thinks of batteries, lithium batteries. But what actually is lithium? Lithium is actually the lightest metal. If you think of your old periodic table, it's number 3. It's a very light metal. It's just a natural element. It's found in the ground. It's not manufactured. What was it used for and where did he find it? Well, it used to be used, and there's a caution here for any listener, do not use it for what I'm about to say. It used to be used to treat gout.
Yes.
Because gout, if you know anything about gout, is caused by uric acid crystals forming in the joint. Very painful. And the theory was that if you gave someone with gout lithium, it would go to the uric acid, turn it into that thing called lithium urate, which is very soluble, and it would just dissolve the crystals in your field grade.
It didn't work.
It never worked, but it didn't stop people using it. So by the time 1946-47, after the war, there's lots of lithium powder in the old pharmacies and the mental hospitals, even though they'd stopped using it. So that's where he got it. It was in the old pharmacies and the old hospitals. It used to be used for gout. So he's now at this point where he's just injected a solution of this lithium, not tablets, it was a powder, into guinea pigs. They go quiet, and he thinks almost instantaneously, maybe I can use this to treat one of these psychotic illnesses like bipolar disorder to quieten someone down. And literally, within weeks, he decides to do this. But he's a very honourable man, and he's worried that he might harm someone. So what he actually does is he stirs up a solution of lithium and he swallows it himself for several weeks. Doesn't tell anyone, including his wife.
But he must have known that wasn't going to be too damaging, given people had used it for many years for gout, obviously to no effect, but it wasn't going to kill you.
Well, It's perfectly true. There was information about it, but I think it's probably fair to say he didn't know with the doses he was going to necessarily think of using how it might affect one. So he felt, and this is a great tradition of Australian science as well. He's not the only person in Australian scientific history who's actually been N1, N equals 1, the first patient. So he does this, and he feels some slight discomfort in his stomach, but he doesn't fall over, he doesn't collapse, he doesn't fit.
Does he quieten down? Does that happen to him, like he did with the guinea pigs? Does he feel a bit...
Well, he may have quietened down, but I do know that when his wife found out afterwards, she was going to kill him, she said, that if he ever did anything like that again without telling her. So he did it on the sly. He was okay, and he literally looked over the back fence, and he decided to stir up a solution of this lithium and give it to a man whose name was Bill Brand, who had been in and out of asylums for close to 30 years with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And he stirs up a solution. He asks the nursing staff to give it to Bill each day and monitors Bill with these notes. We went back and found his original notes. And after a period of a couple of months or so, every hallucination or delusion or dreadful sensation this man had suffered essentially evaporated. And this man was extremely unwell when he was sick with bipolar. He used to be nicknamed the Monkey, which was a terrible name to give him, but that's what he was called in the asylum because he was so filthy and he'd pilfer the rubbish cans looking for scraps of food to eat. And when he was high, elevated, manic, he'd run outside and go to the local cinema, strip naked and sing God Save the King to everyone. So everyone knew him. And the doctors described him in the notes of the time as psychopathic and untreatable. In reality, he had bipolar disorder. Cade gives him this solution. A couple of months, Bill Brand is back to almost normal. And a couple more months, he leaves the asylum and goes back to his old job and his family. And nothing had been seen like that in the history of humankind where someone with this illness had left care like that. And Cade was ecstatic and actually stirred up 9 more solutions of lithium for other bipolar patients, almost all of whom improved. Most of them were discharged. One was a local general practitioner who went back to treating his patients. One worked with the then newspaper, the Herald newspaper in Melbourne. He went back to work. One was a car salesman, and he wrote it up in the Medical Journal of Australia. It's the most cited article in the history of that journal, the Medical Journal of Australia. And what I love about it is that there's not a single statistic in the whole paper. It's just a story. I was in Changi. I had this idea and I treated. The tragic part of the story really happens then, because the first patient he treats, Bill, is well for a while, and then some weeks later he's brought in by the police as psychotic as ever, as mentally ill as ever. And Cade is crestfallen, thinking that lithium has stopped working. That wasn't the case. What had actually happened was that Bill Brand, the first patient, felt so good, he stopped taking the medication, and Cade gave him a second time, and this second time he gave him too much, because back then they didn't know how much to give. And when they gave lithium, they made him toxic with lithium, and he actually died. Lithium's an interesting substance. If you give it, you need to give it at a certain level, but not too much. It's a bit like that story where it's a Goldilocks story, you need exactly the right amount. But Cade was devastated by the death of his first patient, and for many years stopped all research on lithium.
It's interesting, Greg, hearing how he runs his experiments, obviously, in his kitchen using the endless supply of guinea pigs, God rest their souls.
Yes.
But he's not having to go through a lot of the protocols we would place on medical research these days. And you have to query whether that did then encourage that innovation, that he was so flexible to experiment on himself, his own patient. There wasn't ethics panels and various trials that you had to go through before you were allowed to test it on, let alone yourself, but on a human. I mean, do you think today we would have had such an innovation, or was that just sort of the special circumstances of the time?
I think I can let John Cade answer that. He actually raised that himself towards the end of his life. He said that if the strictures that existed later on existed down in the 1940s, he would never have discovered lithium at all. And it's an interesting thing to ponder. because, of course, we rightfully think about the ethics of medical research, and there are many examples where that's gone off the rails. But there are a number of extraordinary discoveries, and this is but one of those extraordinary discoveries, where individuals have done things that are idiosyncratic, that are unusual, that are unfettered, and have led to remarkable improvements. The fact that he could do it in secret by himself, and he knew that he actually at one stage he talked about the fear of maybe being deregistered or what his colleagues would think if things went amiss. So he was aware of what could occur. So he answered it by saying, no, it wouldn't have occurred. The thing that is really important, Georgina, is this. He had suffered greatly in Changi, as many other men and some women did in that environment. And I interviewed about 5 ex-POWs when we were preparing the book, and they were all very similar. They were all individuals who felt that time had been stolen from them, and that when they came back to Australia, they would try and make good of their life. And they would do things that perhaps more timid souls wouldn't. And I think they had a kind of inbuilt courage and a determination just to pursue things because they'd seen life at its most basic. And I'm sure that's something that helped drive John Cade.
So you talk about the medical journal article that was very widely cited, but I mean, how did it catch on, the use of lithium to treat bipolar disorder? Was it a contagion or was it something that people were sceptical of?
Well, what I would say is that it was the first effective medication ever discovered for any mental illness in the world. What actually happened was that...
Which is huge. I mean, huge.
It's huge. So huge. We should know it. So if I
Before
speak
then,
to a group
anything you had, tough.
That's right. If I say to a group of Australians, have you heard of John Cade? You get blank looks. If I say to them, have you heard of Alexander Fleming? Everyone knows penicillin. And I said, this man discovered the first effective medical treatment for psychiatric illness. What actually happened was that a group of doctors and scientists at Melbourne University really saved the day. They worked out that if you took blood tests from people who had bipolar disorder, you give them lithium, you could actually measure the level of lithium in their blood. And you could work out how much they needed to be effective and when it was getting to a danger zone. So they could work out that window. And so they made lithium safe. It then spread from Melbourne around Australia and particularly to Europe initially, France, Italy, and then Scandinavia. Took up the cudgels in the mid to late 1950s. The United States was very slow to pick it up. What I could say, though, is that all the other classes of medication we now use to treat psychiatric illness were largely discovered in the decade following John Cade's discovery. So there was this kind of influx of a range of medications from the late 40s through to 1960, but the first was lithium.
That's amazing. And I mean, here at Melbourne University, there are things that commemorate John Cade. I think is there a scholarship and a lecture? So we don't really forget him entirely here at Melbourne University, although I guess if you're outside of the medical faculty, it's probably not coming across your radar as much as it should. But what do you think, Greg, is Cade's enduring legacy for Australia, but for the world?
I think his enduring legacy, well, there are two, of course. The first is that he completely turned on its head the way we might consider treating the mentally ill. So the notion, for example, that an inanimate substance, salt of the earth, an element, number 3, you can dig up from the earth, can actually treat something as complex and as devastating as bipolar illness. That was almost unbelievable to people at the time, that a biochemical cure, if you like, or treatment could occur. So a lot of people had to make an enormous leap.
Yeah, so it seems so simple in a way, doesn't it?
And it's so simple. And of course, it's not promoted by pharmaceutical companies because you can't take a patent on it. So that's an important issue. But I think the second one is this, and this is where the university would come in. John Cade never saw himself as a research scientist. He was first and foremost an observer of clinical condition. He saw himself as a clinician, and it was his astute clinical observations that probably led to his discovery of lithium. And he said that everyone every doctor should do some sort of research, whatever it is. And he also said, not only should they do research, they should be brave in their research. They shouldn't just repeat what people have done. And I think that's an important lesson, because if you look at the masses of papers that are published in science and medicine, sometimes you wonder, well, of course it's important, but a lot of the papers just repeat what's being done. And I'm not sure if they're not too tentative. They don't necessarily, I think Cade would say they should be more bold in the questions they ask. Again, he was doing this when there were no ethics committees.
I was going to say, but yes, he was doing this at a time when the strictures on medical research were nothing compared to today. But
one thing I did want to, if I could say, because I think, and it is also linked to Melbourne University, and this is another story that we're actually working on now. I mentioned in passing when Cade made this discovery, there was a group of scientists and doctors at Melbourne University who worked out how to make lithium safe. They, as a group, deserve extraordinary accolades, as does Melbourne University. And it involves a remarkable professor, Pansy Wright, who helped bring in a young, or it's actually middle-aged, but I say youngish middle-aged German doctor who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, came to Australia as a refugee, was in a refugee camp, and he was brought to Melbourne University, and he was fundamental in making lithium safe. His name was Edward Troutner.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that Melbourne University, where I'm sitting today, had at least the ecosystem to facilitate this type of medical research, and obviously groundbreaking treatment for people suffering from this disorder. Greg, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about John Cade today, and I do recommend your book to our listeners. He was an extraordinary Australian and rightly was awarded an Order of Australia and the Kitay Award, the world's richest prize in psychiatry in the 1970s. So well deserved. Thank you for bringing us.
Thank you so much, Georgina. It's a pleasure being on your show.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.